Hello, and welcome to our session titled Lessons Learned During the Pandemic That Enhance In-Person Learning for the 2021 OSIP Leadership and Project Directors Conference. Disclaimer. The contents of this presentation were developed by the presenters for the 2021 OSIP conference. However, these contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. I'm Christy Liu, the TIES Center Director. I'm presenting today with my colleagues, Jessica Bowman, the TIES Co-Principal Director, and Terry Vandercook, the TIES Assistant Director. The TIES Center is the National Technical Assistance Center on Inclusive Practices and Policies for Students with Significant Cognitive Disabilities. TIES stands for Increasing Time, Instructional Effectiveness, Engagement in General Education Curriculum and with age grade peers, and Systems Change Support for Inclusive Practices.
This past year has given us a great opportunity to look at how we are providing education. On the left side of this slide, you will see graphic symbols of a school and a teacher teaching in a classroom, with an arrow to the right of the slide showing a house and a student engaging in learning on their laptop. As we all know, our education system had to shift in a significant way during this past year and a half. While it is widely acknowledged that student learning faltered during the pandemic, the education system as a whole learned a great deal as it began to find new ways to engage and teach students. For students with significant cognitive disabilities, distance learning presented both frustration and opportunities to make education more inclusive than it was before the pandemic. While change was the norm during the past year, some important constants remained. First, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is still a law that requires students with disabilities to learn in the least restrictive environment, with access and progress in the general education curriculum. That law has not changed. The second thing that didn't change is research affirming that students with significant cognitive disabilities learn best when taught in general education classrooms with grade level peers. Third, we know there is always a need for sustained and multifaceted professional learning to improve the quality and accessibility of instructional practice. Finally, we know that parent and teacher collaboration is critical. Keeping each of these constants in mind remains a necessity. This slide shows three people with an idea light bulb above their heads denoting an opportunity. Now that we are hopefully on the other side of the pandemic and the widespread need for distance learning, we need to consider what we have learned during the pandemic crisis and not unquestioningly return to how education looked prior to the pandemic. We have the opportunity to capture what we have learned and move forward in positive ways that can benefit all students, especially those who are marginalized.
During the pandemic, schools and families who were committed to the values of inclusive education had to be creative to address barriers to learning. This slide indicates 5 key learnings that were evident from our work with schools and families and are ones that we think should guide future work as well. We will provide a very brief overview of each key learning and then go into a bit more detail on number 4, expand universal design, and also have the opportunity to hear from some of our colleagues in the state of Washington related to the use of universal design. Washington is one of the states that the TIES Center works with intensively, collaborating to improve the practices, structures, and policies needed in support of equitable and inclusive schools. Lesson number 1, don't abandon the curriculum. The key point here is that a student's IEP is not a curriculum. A complete education includes making progress both in the general education curriculum and on IEP goals in inclusive environments. It is not one or the other. Lesson 2, harness the power of urgency. The pandemic created an urgency to solve problems that never existed before. This urgency fueled creativity about how to teach students in inclusive classrooms. We must take this urgency and creativity and push it forward to open up inclusive opportunities for all students. Lesson 3, build on the progress made with school-family collaboration. During the pandemic, schools and families collaborated in multiple ways through Zoom, email, text, school platforms, regular mail, and dropping off materials in mailboxes. They connected as needed to coordinate instruction and support learning. Understanding these new ways and building on them could reframe what effective collaboration with families looks like. Lesson 4, expand universal design for learning. Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, was embraced by many teachers to engage diverse learners online. Some teachers might not even have been aware of the UDL framework, but because of their persistence to engage students in multiple ways, they changed how they taught and how students showed what they learned. Similarly, UDL would enhance learning in inclusive classrooms for far more students if expanded during in-person learning. And lesson 5, belonging and friendship are fundamental. They're not just nice things. Many students felt a huge loss from not being with their peers when the country shifted to distance learning. We've always known the importance of peer relationships, but it became even clearer during the pandemic that peer relationships with classmates and friends are central for all students. Promoting peer relationships needs to be a priority to support students in being part of the fabric of their community. And now, as promised, we want to share some additional perspectives and ideas on the Expand Universal Design for Learning lesson by hearing from some of our collaborative partners in Washington State. We will listen to clips from Justin Poulos, the Washington State Director of Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, Dr. Shannon Hitch, the Executive Director of Special Services for the Lake Washington School District, Michael Clark, Principal for Norman Rockwell Elementary, Craig Mott, Principal for Mark Twain Elementary, and Dinah Carew Olsen, the parent of a student with extensive support needs in one of the Washington elementary schools.
Here is Justin Poulos, the MTSS Director at the Washington Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, describing how he sees the application of UDL within MTSS and across the different tiers of support.
What we often hear is this upside down triangle, and that we have all these students at tier 3 because of COVID and the needs from COVID. And what I think we need to be doing is thinking about this upside down triangle really being an hourglass, and that we need to let the sand come back to the bottom of the hourglass so that we reimagine and we rebuild what tier 1 is. And I think this is incredibly valuable for us to think about for students with significant cognitive disabilities. And I think it's also something that is a good universal approach for all students, especially as we know that we have new and heightened changes and needs in our students. So this could be mental health, this could be academic learning, this could be social learning and engagement. And through this, what we can be thinking about is how do we create new opportunities to engage students and to allow students to express themselves. So things that could include optional first day of school, or creating videos that are like social stories and stuff that we can send home over the summer and have parents working with students, helping to get them ready for the fall and what this is going to look like in the fall. And then if they come to a first day of school, that maybe creates some additional opportunity for any student to engage and be part of just that transition back at the end of summer. I think we can also be thinking about how are we representing the needs and the abilities and the expectations, whether safety or health or or others within the buildings. So having graphic representation, for example, across the school, as we're kind of approaching this idea of coming back in a different way than we've been in school for a couple years now, is really taking advantage to just rethink what do we do for all students, and how do we create new tier one processes, curricula, strategies that are going to work for every student or have more flexibility for every student.
Here's Dr. Shannon Hitch, the Executive Director for Special Services for the Lake Washington School District, sharing the district's perspective on the inclusionary practices across the three areas of relationships, equity, and instruction that she thinks can positively impact the opportunity gap that exists for students of color, students in poverty, and students with disabilities.
So, as in many districts, Lake Washington demonstrates an opportunity gap. We demonstrate really remarkable outcomes for a lot of our students with some of the highest graduation rates in Washington State. However, it's not true for all of our students. Our students of color, those in poverty, and our students with disabilities are not transitioning from our district future ready, which is really what our district vision and mission is all about. We know that there's a lot of initiatives in education, everything from PBIS to culturally sustaining pedagogy to trauma-informed practices. The list goes on. And all of those initiatives are meant to close that opportunity gap and help all students be successful. In my mind, however, none of those initiatives are going to be successful without the full integration and, more importantly, participation of students with disabilities. Inclusion is really meant for all students, but in particular, those that are at the greatest risk within our educational system. As such, our district's working with the TIE Center to ensure that we're bringing all of the knowledge and expertise and resources necessary to launch inclusion work here in our district. We believe that inclusion provides us with the opportunity to focus first on relationships. It includes positive behavior supports, creating a sense of belonging, and helping students develop meaningful peer relationships. We also believe it gives us the opportunity to focus on equity. As we focus on ableism, belief systems, and building structures that can actually interfere with student success. Finally, it also allows us to focus on instruction, using universal design for learning, PLCs that include both special education and general education teachers, as well as evidence-based instructional practices. Our goal is to leverage inclusion as really the overarching theme. It's part of our theory of action in addressing what we know is a problem of practice, the opportunity gap that needs to be eliminated for all of our students. Thank you.
Here's Michael Clark, a school principal, discussing how his teachers and staff pivoted during distance learning in the area of universal design and how that learning and work will help as they scale up inclusive practices for all students.
In the midst of a pandemic, we maintained our commitment to inclusion and inclusive practice. And we decided if we have to reinvent our world anyways, we're going to move it toward justice and access. So universal design for learning was a key component of our work. We realized early on that we had to know and respond to the needs of our students, and we had to provide a multitude of access points and scaffolds for our learners. So UDL gave us a common language for that work, and it opened up the door to multiple high-leverage instructional moves that benefited all of our learners. When I visited remote classrooms, I very quickly saw teachers and classified team members across grade levels using tools such as visuals and realia and graphic organizers and sentence stems. And I also saw team members providing a variety of ways for students to share their understanding, whether that was a written prompt using predictive text or if it was a video response using Flipgrid. How did structures like help desk support your staff in use of UDL during distance learning? So the Inclusion Help Desk was a wish list item for us, and I'm so grateful to TIES and the University of Washington Herring Center for bringing it to life. The Help Desk was as an MTSS support similar to our student intervention team that provided us with real-time supports and resources for our students around inclusive practices that our teachers could implement right away. It also kept the focus on inclusion at the forefront of our work versus having it be a topic that we talk about sporadically throughout the year during professional learning sessions. In addition, we've developed a bank of resources from our help desk sessions that we've stored centrally and we're going to come back to. How do you think any of your learning or work during the pandemic might help as you consider scaling up inclusive practices for all students, including those students with significant cognitive disabilities at Rockwell? Again, our work with students and families during the pandemic offered us a mindset and a paradigm shift. If we can promote inclusive practice during a once-in-a-lifetime, unprecedented pandemic, we can do it every school year. We tooled up this year and we engaged in professional learning, in large part around UDL. That's going to set the stage for our next steps in the year to come. This year also compelled our general and special educators to plan and collaborate in a deeper way than they ever have before. And I've actually had multiple staff members tell me that not only do they want to include those practices in that work, they want to expand it. Also in the year to come, we're going to be adding intervention blocks to our daily schedule. So thank you again to TIES and UW for your support of our students. We're very passionate about this inclusive work, and I'm excited for all of our students to return in the fall. Rockwell students deserve access to their general education classroom curriculum and peers, and they're going to get just that next year. Have a great summer, everyone.
And here's Craig Mott, another school principal, discussing how his teachers and staff pivoted during distance learning in the area of universal design and how that learning will help them as they move forward.
The staff had to quickly identify and recognize that their audience in many cases wasn't just their students, but they were parents and guardians, and therefore they had to create a partnership with those individuals at the home to help support learning. Thirdly, lesson development required our teachers not only focus on the what to be taught, but the how students would be learning, but also how would they be demonstrating that learning and understanding of the content in a remote world. How did PLC support our work? Well, we knew the work was already going to be hard. None of our teachers were familiar or had background in remote teaching. And so PLCs allowed us to bring more people to the table. Specifically, we could bring interventionists, we could bring support personnel, we could bring classroom teachers into the fold when it came to developing and planning for lesson development. Through that collaboration, they were able to identify the key concepts to be taught, develop lessons to support each of those other classes, and they could also identify barriers that may impact instruction opportunity or learning, and in turn collaborate together in ways to overcome those barriers and creating access to learning. How do you think any of your learning / work during the pandemic might help as you consider scaling up inclusive practices for all students, including those with significant learning disabilities? I think more than anything is we started to recognize the importance of relying on each other and teaming and being transparent and collaborative and honest and in some cases vulnerable in terms of what our skill that we don't have at this point. Teachers were able to recognize that there has to be intentionality when they come to the planning phase, and it's no longer just about meeting everybody in the middle or forcing kids to come to the middle. It is looking at your whole class, and whether that is a student with significant learning disabilities or not, it's identifying the barriers that are preventing them from learning or being a part of that community and creating access points. The other component is that we've learned from it is we also need to continue to remind everyone that UDL is flexible and fluid. It's not going to look the same in every classroom, and nor should it. And so that's the importance of being able to come together as a team and generate ideas and be able to bring scenarios to the group so that they are able to process and come up with solutions. And finally, this work is hard, and our staff realized how hard it was to provide a remote learning environment, but they also found more comfort in knowing that they were doing it as a collaborative group. And as such, they were more open to trying new and different ideas when someone brought it to the table.
And lastly, here is Dinah Karu Olsen discussing her and her daughter's experience during distance learning in the area of universal design, including what they think could be improved upon and how UDL can be used to support inclusive practices for all students, including those with extensive needs.
Hi, my name is Dinah Karu Olsen, and I am the very proud parent of a beginning fourth grader and a first ever astronaut with Down syndrome hopeful named Aune. We live in Kirkland, Washington, and Aune is included 100% of her day at Twain Elementary in Lake Washington School District. As a parent in the Lake Washington School District, what was my experience during distance learning in the area of universal design? For my kid, it made the difference between her being able to access instruction and her having no access. Game changer. Clear as that. Often, I can sense a fear of large-scale scaffolds from teachers because we do spend so much time talking about and thinking about rigor. But if the end goal is meaningful engagement ending in mastery and the ability to extrapolate on that learning, then why wouldn't we create as much access as we can for everyone? Did I or my daughter's team learn anything that I could think would improve upon the use of universal design as my daughter returns to in-person instruction? I think we've only just dipped our toes in the water of UDL, and to me it seems like shifting even more of the focus from the back end and from designing for access to do with how my kid would show her knowledge, to primarily thinking about the existing variability in the classroom and how to meaningfully engage all students at all times, and then intentionally weaving a specially designed instruction into that is the way forward. What role do I see universal design playing in the effort to support inclusive education for each and every student in the district, including those with extensive needs? It is the most crucial component. Regardless of the specific curricula used, the framework, the packaging has to be UDL, or there will always be those kids who fall through the cracks. UDL, when implemented as a design and intentional collaboration process, is the only way to incorporate SDI also for those students with extensive support needs, so that the SDI isn't an add-on or an extra layer on top of a full plate. Something else that's important to think about as the district engages in this work is to have an ongoing conversation about UDL as something that can't and shouldn't be reduced to a checklist or a flowchart, but that is guided by the ecosystem that springs from the variability of the specific students in the classroom.
As we heard from our colleagues in Washington, we took note of a main idea that we took from each video in the handout that accompanies this presentation. We also identified additional strategies that were shared. Justin Poulos, the state MTSS director, shared about reimagining Tier 1 instruction for all students. He suggested an optional first day of school or visuals with behavior expectations for all students. Dr. Shannon Hitch, the Executive Director of Special Services, shared the importance of eliminating the opportunity gap through building relationships, promoting equity, and supporting accessible instruction for all students. Michael Clark, one of the school principals, shared that his staff are undergoing a mindset shift with a focus on flexibility for all students. Craig Mott, another school principal, shared their focus on the opportunities they've had to expand and extend teacher collaboration. And Dinah Karu Olsen shared about the critical role UDL plays for her daughter with a disability, that what is nice and beneficial for all students is critical for some students. Each one of these lessons provides us a window of how universal design for learning, when expanded during distance learning, can positively impact instruction and student learning. These are lessons that we want to take forward and continue to build on so that we can continue to build educational systems that offer equitable opportunities for all students, including those with significant cognitive disabilities.
Remember the opportunity that we put forth at the beginning of this presentation to capture what we have learned during the pandemic and move forward in positive ways? This slide suggests 3 ways that you could consider doing that based upon the presentation. 1, share the article that describes the 5 key learnings and discuss them with the collaborative partners with whom you work. 2, consider some of the specific suggestions offered by the practitioners in Washington State for expanding universal design for learning in support of equitable and inclusive schools. And we've included some of those strategies that were shared by practitioners in the handout that accompanies this presentation. And 3, share other TIES Center resources with your collaborative colleagues as you work to create and sustain equitable and inclusive schools. And in support of those ideas, we have provided links to be able to access the suggested resources on the handout that accompanies this presentation. That includes links to the TIES Center homepage, as well as to the article that describes the 5 lessons in the presentation. Thanks again for viewing this presentation. We hope it provided some useful ideas and resources in support of your work.